Hi there, my name is Jen. My YouTube name is Jen Lee, and I am excited to be here with you today for day number 14 of INKtoberfest 2022. And today we're going to be talking about paper and why paper type matters with different mediums. So I've gone ahead and pulled out several pieces of paper from my stash, and these are the papers that I'm going to share with you today, along with some other specialty papers. And each slide or section has a question on it. I would love it if you would answer the question in the comments so I could get to know you a little bit better. The first medium we're going to do is inks, and I'm using some Maker Forte inks in Raw Skirt and Sugar Plum. And on the bottom of the screen on all of these samples, you'll see which paper I'm using. So for this first example, I am using the Strathmore Bristol Smooth. It is a 300 series, which means it's basically right in the middle of the paper spectrum as far as Strathmore grades their papers. And you'll see it gets a really nice blend between those two colors. And then, of course, since these are water reactive inks, I'm going to go ahead and spritz that with a little bit of water to see how the paper reacts to water, and also to see if it picks up that ink and gives that watermark effect, which of course this does. And from this we can see that this is a smooth paper and it takes at least light water use well. And we're going to move on to the hammer mill. This is the 32-pound premium color copy paper, and this blends as well really nicely. It is a smooth paper. It's a little more splotchy to start out. It might take a little bit more work than the Bristol did, but it still smooths out to a nice even blend. And then we're going to go ahead and take the water and spritz that to see how well it does with water. And you'll see that instead of giving the watermark effect, it actually just raises the paper. So basically the paper is getting wet and the fibers are expanding. They're creating kind of those pits almost in the paper, or like raised little mountains in the paper, I guess. And I think it gives it a really cool texture, but it does not handle water very well, and so I would not recommend using that with water, but ink blending is just fine. The next paper is the Accent Opaque White Cardstock. I use the 120 because it's excellent for card bases, but I want to just go ahead and show how that blends out with the inks. And again, it might take a little bit more work, but it does blend out really nicely. And we're going to go ahead and spritz that. And this is another paper that does not handle water well. It reacts similarly to the hammer mill, with the paper kind of raising up and giving like pock marks. So that does not give the effect of the watermarks. But again, the texture looks cool, and if that's something that you're interested in, it definitely wouldn't be a no-go as far as using the paper with a little bit of water. And then we're going to go ahead and move on to the Maker Geminio, and we're doing the flat side first, and this blends out really, really nicely as well. It's just a really nice smooth paper with a really nice, beautiful blend, similar to the Strathmore Bristol Smooth paper. It blends out really nicely, and it's also going to give the nice water marks just like the Bristol does. So this is an excellent paper for ink blending. However, on the shiny side of the Geminio, the ink tends to stick and not move real well. So this is not a paper that I would recommend for any kind of ink blending. It also, when you have something down on the shiny side, it is going to stay there, whether that's ink or stamping, it will stay there and not move, and that's exactly what happened with this. It did not pick up any of that ink when spraying with water. The next is the Strathmore watercolor. This is the 300 series again, which is that mid-grade paper. It blends really nicely because it is a watercolor paper. It has texture, and it's going to take a little bit more ink than, say, some of the other smoother papers. I would not necessarily use that for ink blending just because it is a little more expensive than some of the other papers. The same with the Fabriano hot press. It blends really nicely because it is a smooth paper paper, but it is a watercolor paper. And again, the price point just doesn't justify using it for ink blending. So my favorite out of those would be the Bristol Smooth, followed in a close second by the Maker Forte Geminio paper for ink blending. Next, we're going to use some markers on the paper, and mainly to do some watercoloring. And so I am taking some Tombow markers, which are dye-based markers, and adding that to the paper. And these first two papers, we learned in the last section that they do not do well with water, so these are not going to blend real well. It's going to be the Accent Opaque White and the Hammer Mill, and you'll see I'm going to wet my brush and try and move that color around the paper, and it just does not work. I also wanted to mention the top half of the Nesting Dolls stamp from Maker Forte is inked up in Memento, and then the bottom half that I'm working on right now is inked up in VersaFine. All of these papers stamped really well. The textured paper, such as the watercolor paper, it won't heat emboss as well as some of the others that are smooth, but it still will work. We're going to go ahead and move on to the Fabriano Hot Press, which is a watercolor paper, and as you can expect, it's going to move on. The markers are going to move on that paper, but again, because of the price point, it's not something I would use on a regular basis for this type of a technique. The next one is the Strathmore watercolor. So this has got a little bit of a texture. The Strathmore Watercolor 300 is a cold press paper compared to the Fabriano Hot Press. That just means it's got a little bit of texture. Basically, the difference between the two is the way that it's manufactured. And so that worked really well as expected. The Maker Geminio shiny side, we learned in the last slide that stuff does not move on that paper. So while the ink stayed, and that again is Memento and VersaFine, neither of them were heat embossed. They stayed beautifully on that paper. However, on the flat side of the Geminio, this is not heat embossed, and that water just moved all over the place, even though, or the ink moved all over the place, even though the bottom portion was VersaFine, which is a pigment ink, and it shouldn't move. It did move on that paper. And then this one's my favorite, Bristol Smooth. It's my favorite paper to use for watercoloring with markers. The paper just, or the ink just moves really smoothly and easily, and so that would be my choice for watercoloring with dye-based markers. Of course, if you just wanted to use markers to color with, most of these papers will work, with the exception of the Geminio paper on the shiny side. So again, here are all the papers, and as expected, the watercolor paper performs the best because that is what it is made for. But the other papers, the shiny side of the Geminio, as well as the Hammer Mill and Accent Opaque, don't really handle water that well. And next we're going to move on to some alcohol ink markers, and I had colored the top portion of these Nesting Dolls with some alcohol markers and then realized I wasn't recording, so I'm going to go ahead and color the faces so that you can see how well this performs. I am using the Hammer Mill cardstock first. I would say the Hammer Mill is most closely similar to maybe a Nina paper, and I wanted to say also that going through this video, that I think paper is really subjective. There are certain papers obviously you wouldn't use for certain things, but there are so many papers out there to choose from, and I think part of the process, especially as a new card maker, is to figure out which paper you like the best. So for example, if you are a Copic marker colorist and you want the best paper that you can possibly use for Copic coloring or alcohol marker coloring, you're probably going to look at a different type of paper than maybe I would, who is not a Copic colorist. There are papers that won't bleed through the back if that's something that you're interested in. But for me, I'm just showing kind of what I have and what I use. And there are certainly other papers out there. You know, if you're really looking to get the best and the price doesn't matter, you would probably go more with a paper that is specifically designed for whatever medium you are using. And so I just wanted you to keep that in mind as you watch this video, that these are basically, you know, what I prefer, and just with a little experimentation, definitely papers that you can see won't work for certain mediums. As you saw, the Geminio flat side did not do well with the markers, and neither did the shiny side, because the shiny side is going to grab that ink and just hold it there and not move it, and then the flat side just moves it a little bit too much. I think the best paper for alcohol marker coloring and what I use is the Hammer Mill. It's an excellent price point, and I think it blends super nicely. You'll see that the watercolor papers actually handle the alcohol ink well. I think it looks really nice. However, you're going to end up using a lot more of your ink to try and get a good blend on watercolor paper, because that watercolor paper is going to absorb that ink. And then you could also there is also the possibility that your brush nib will become damaged over the watercolor paper, especially the cold press, which has a little bit of texture. So just keep that in mind when picking out paper. Also, it's not the best price point to use a watercolor paper for your alcohol markers. So again, my choice for alcohol markers would be a Hammer Mill or something similar to that. And next we're going to move on to colored pencils. And just a quick disclaimer, colored pencils are not something I work with on a regular basis. And in fact, I rarely use them. So for me, this is kind of coming from the standpoint of a beginner, or somebody that does not have a lot of experience with colored pencils. The Geminio flat side, I think it does decent with the blending these two colors of pencils. I've got like a lighter teal and a darker teal, but it does rub a little bit, and it does, as you can see, some of the pencil just does not stay on the paper, and that is definitely the case with the Geminio shiny side. It does not the pencil does not hold on the paper at all. There's absolutely no grip to it, because that is a shiny paper. That is not going to work. And next we've got the Hammer Mill, which I think is really smooth. I'm not using Gamsol or anything like that to go ahead and blend out my colors, but I do take a white colored pencil and go over the colored pencil that I've already done. And again, this is kind of subjective. If you're used to colored pencils and it's something that you use regularly and your skill level is a little bit advanced, you're probably going to have a specific paper that you like just for colored pencils, depending on which technique you are using colored pencils with. But just for basic coloring, all these papers that I'm showing do really nicely, with the exception of the Geminio paper. Neither side works really well with colored pencil, so I wouldn't recommend that. But all of these others are just fine with the colored pencils. And again, I know when I look at products that I want to use, I am looking at both the quality and the price point. So I would probably not be using my watercolor paper for colored pencils, although I think it gives it a really nice kind of texture, a little bit of a splotchy texture, which I think is kind of cool in some instances. So this last paper I pulled out is not one that I'm using in all of my techniques, but it was a paper that I had in my stash specifically for colored pencils. And again, to my untrained eye, these all looked really nice and they blended out really nicely. So I would use any of them, but as far as comparing price to quality, I would probably stick with the Hammer Mill or the Accent Opaque White for doing any kind of colored pencil work. However, I did do a little bit of research on colored pencils and the paper to use, and a lot of this consensus was, especially if you're using Gamsol, to use a Bristol vellum, which is not vellum like you would think, the clear vellum. It's a paper that is actually vellum. It has a little bit more tooth to it, and colored pencils, I have read, work really well on that type of paper. Next, we're going to move on to watercolor paper, and I just wanted to really quickly go over the hot press and the cold press. These are actually reversed. The hot press is the smooth paper. A cold press is a textured paper. These are both Fabriano, and I just wanted to kind of show the difference difference between the two. The hot press or cold press is the way in which the paper is manufactured. That's where they get their names. But I just remember that the hot press is a smooth flat paper and the cold press is a textured paper. And I wanted to show you the watercolor paper there are just so many ranges in my opinion. And I've been through lots of different watercolor paper, and I have lots of different watercolor paper because it's one of my favorite things. And so here you'll see these are all cold press, which means they're all textured. You can see the one on the left-hand side is more textured than the other two. The one on the far right is 100% cotton, which would be the cream of the crop of watercolor paper. And it's got a really beautiful texture. And I think the texture of 100% cotton is similar to Strathmore, which is probably, if I were going to take a guess, somewhere around 25%, maybe a little bit more than that. But my choice for watercolor paper is going to be the Strathmore Watercolor 300. It is a paper that, again, the 300 is kind of like the mid-range, and I think I love the texture more than anything. It's just got a really beautiful kind of textured, smooth look to it. And so I'm just going to go ahead and do some freehand watercoloring of some flowers. And for this section, I'm mainly using just watercolor paper, but I did want to show how the ink moves on the hammer mill, which, as we remember, doesn't handle water well. But, you know, actually this surprised me that it took the ink as well as it did. It's not going to withstand a lot of scrubbing. It's going to destroy the fibers of the paper if there is too much of that, which is one of the things about watercolor, is adding layer upon layer. So this wouldn't be a good paper to watercolor with, but it actually did perform surprisingly well, considering that it does not do well with water. And then I'm going to go ahead and move on to the Strathmore Bristol Smooth, which is a favorite paper of mine, but I don't think it does well with the pan watercolors. If you'll remember, this does really well with markers and water, but this does not take a lot of scrubbing, so this would not do well with adding different layers. Because it does not like to be worked too much. So if you were just doing one layer, it would be fine, but adding multiple layers, it would not work as well. And so as I go through the other papers, I wanted to mention that there are lots of different watercolor papers out there that range in quality, and it's kind of just finding what works best for you price-wise and what works best for you as far as the texture or how the paper reacts to different watercolors. And the thing about watercolor paper and watercolors in general is that you can have the same brand of paper react differently to different brands of watercolors. So it really is about experimenting with some different paper types and see which one you like the best and works best with your budget. As far as hot press and cold press, some of the characteristics of hot press is a smooth paper. It's great for detail. It's great for glazing, which basically means just adding layers. It doesn't hold the ink as well. It's less absorbent, which basically means that you have more time to work whatever you're working as compared to the cold press, which absorbs the ink more quickly, which also means that the color is going to be less vivid on a cold press as compared to a hot press. And again, there is a slight texture to the cold press, and actually texture ranges depending on brand. There also is another type of watercolor paper. It's called rough, and it's a really rough watercolor paper that doesn't get talked about as often, but there is that paper out there as well. And next we're going to do alcohol inks. The question for this is gloves on or off. I don't like gloves, so I don't use gloves, but I know that's not for everybody. So that is my question for this slide. I'm going to be using some Marabou alcohol inks. This is a blending solution that is not a blending solution. It is actually isopropyl alcohol that I put into a blending bottle. And I wanted to start out showing you why you wouldn't use a regular paper or an uncoated paper. So basically Strathmore Bristol Smooth is a porous paper, and it does not work real well with alcohol inks because alcohol inks need that shiny surface to kind of glide on to give that really beautiful effect, and you can see it does not work well. So I just wanted to throw that one paper in there so you can kind of see why an alcohol ink wouldn't work really well on a porous paper. And we're going to start out with some UPO for these alcohol inks, and I'm going to do each paper in two different ways. I'm going to do it applying the blending solution first and then the alcohol inks, and so that is what this first example is, and I'm just using some really pretty orange and red colors and moving that around with my baby aspirator, and then I'll dry that up. And you can see if you hold heat on UPO, it will melt just like any plastic will. Some last longer before they start to melt, which is why if you're going to use heat on any of the plastics, you want to make sure you kind of do it in pulses. So heat a little bit and then remove the heat, heat a little bit and then remove the heat until you've got the paper dried. The other side I'm doing here is adding the alcohol ink first, and then the blending solution. Sometimes it tends to leave the marks where the ink has kind of dropped onto the paper. And then also I wanted to show that on a wet ink you can smear that off of the UPO paper really easily, but once the ink has dried, it does not remove as easily, and it can be a great thing to have that ink remove easily, especially if you're like, oh, I don't really like this. I just want to take all of that ink off and start over and not have to use another piece of paper. The graphic craft plastic, which is this next one, is really great for actually removing the ink. So this is some dried ink, and you'll see that it removes really easily. It takes a little bit, of adding that solution or the isopropyl alcohol to get it totally clear, but it does actually come out where you can reuse that and just totally start over. Craft plastic is my choice for alcohol inks because it is very cost effective. It takes heat very well, and it's just a really nice paper to use. You can get the same effect as UPO, which can be quite pricey, and so this is the type that I like to use. Then we're going to move on to Geminio Shiny, and again I am adding the alcohol ink first on this one and then the solution, and you kind of see with those circles where the ink has kind of settled when it's first dropped, and that actually happens on a lot of the papers that you're using alcohol inks with. The color will kind of concentrate there, which is why it's better to use the solution first and then drop the alcohol ink into it. I did heat up the Geminio on the shiny side. You kind of see, I don't know if it's the paper, maybe I got it too hot. It will take heat, but I think maybe just don't hold the heat onto it, or you'll get kind of those cracks in the paper, which I kind of think are cool. It adds a little bit of character, but if you don't like that, maybe just watch how much heat you're putting on and how long you're holding it on to the paper. Then we're going to move on to the Geminio on the flat side. I added the color first and then the isopropyl alcohol. This actually worked really well as far as getting those kind of color spots to blend out. So it worked really well. And again, I want to reiterate, you can use both the flat and the shiny side of the Geminio. You just have to add the blending solution or your isopropyl alcohol first before you add the alcohol ink, and that will give it kind of a vector, if you will, to move around that alcohol ink. And next I'm going to go ahead and use some black craft plastic. So instead of the white, this is the black. It's going to react the same as far as the items moving around or the ink moving around. But as you can see, I'm using the same colors as I did for the white, and the black kind of just takes away that color. You can't really see it, so it doesn't make sense to use it. But it does work perfectly for the alcohol ink pearls or any kind of alcohol ink that's got that sparkle or glitter in it, or the metallics. This also works really well for metallic watercolor. So if you like working with metallic watercolor and you're looking for something that'll give it just really a stunning effect, this black craft plastic works really well. And I'm just going to add the different colors and move that around with the isopropyl alcohol and my baby aspirator. These are actually Marabou. The first one was a Ranger pearl, and then the rest of these are there is a rainbow color of alcohol ink in or it's called Rainbow in the Marabou line, and it's basically just glitter. It's just beautiful, as well as these others that I'm showing you. One is a metallic blue. We've got another one that's kind of a green gold color. And this is really fun to do to make galaxy backgrounds. I'm adding a little bit of white, which Ranger also has a white in their line as well. But putting that white on and then kind of moving that around, I think it gives it a really beautiful kind of galaxy look. And I just can't get over that sparkle. And I didn't show it. I lost some footage for the alcohol inks on black mixed media paper. So this is a cardstock. It is porous, but if you heat emboss white or gold and then put the alcohol inks over it, the alcohol ink will stick to the embossed areas, and it just gives a really stunning effect. So I wanted to go ahead and throw that in there and show that it can be used on some cardstock. And again, that was mixed media cardstock, so it handles water well, as long as you put some embossing or something that the alcohol ink can stick to. You can get some really beautiful effects. And so just kind of in summary here, these are all of the papers or the plastics that were used for alcohol inks. I'm going to show you one more after this, and it's kind of a vellum-y paper, and I don't really go over vellum in this video just because there are so many other papers, but vellum can also be used for alcohol inks. It is a non-porous surface, so that alcohol ink will move on it really nicely. I'm going to show you one of my favorites that I use for alcohol inks that's kind of got that translucent feel to it. And so that paper is actually called Duralar. And it's just one of my favorites. It's kind of a new to me product within the last year. I was sent these products, and I absolutely love it. I think it gives kind of that ethereal look. You can layer the paper over other alcohol inks papers or over other cardstock just for a really beautiful kind of wispy look. And so I'm just adding the alcohol inks to this and using my baby aspirator to move that around. And then the awesome thing about this is you can use the side that you applied the alcohol ink to, or you can just flip it over, and it's got kind of more of a muted feel to it. This, however, this is actually a polyester film. It does not cut real well, so die cutting would not be great for this, but it cuts like in a paper trimmer like paper would. It just doesn't cut that great using die cuts. And then I wanted to go ahead and show you how I'm going to organize this. This is my tag from last year. I absolutely love Alex's idea to put all of these on tags. It's a super cool reference, and it's also a good inspiration piece as well, where you can, if you're kind of stuck, you can pick that up and kind of flip through your techniques or what have you, and kind of see them at a glance. And so I've done the same thing this year, as I have used the tags that Make Your Forte has. And for each paper type, I have added each of the techniques. So I've got the watercolor, the ink blending, the stamping, the alcohol markers, the colored pencils, the dye-based markers. And so I have put all of those on the front, and it's a really fun way to kind of just see at a glance how different products work on different papers. And then when you flip it over, it's going to have the name of the product and what I've just put what I think it's best for, and then some of the other uses for the paper, the characteristics of the paper, and what it's not recommended for. And so I've gone ahead and I have done that for all of the papers. And the tags are a really great way, as I mentioned previously, to kind of have everything in one place, to pull out when you need it for inspiration or because you need a reminder of something. And so I really love just flipping through it and kind of looking at it and seeing all of the different colors and mediums that are on the papers. And lastly, I wanted to thank you for hanging out with me today for day 14 of INKtoberfest. Don't forget there are lots of videos this month with lots of inspiration and information and techniques to learn about or kind of refresh. I hope that you found this video informative and helpful, and that you can take away something that can use in your own craft room. So thanks so much again, and have a great rest of your day.